in this day and age, this is 2026, about 1 in 10%, 1 in 10 of the households on the continent don't even have toilet facilities. And a substantial number have toilet facilities outside their compounds. Now imagine, you have to go to relieve yourself in the day, and you have to walk outside, some distance. Everyone sees that, oh, look at that person. In the night, the kind of indignity that we are, and risk actually, that we are putting our people, our women, our children, people with disabilities, to have to walk to just relieve themselves outside their compound at the risk of even being attacked on the way. Democracy, our theory of democracy, has to lead it to put the dignity of our citizens at the heart and deliver some of these kind of very, very basic needs. When we ask across the continent whether the military should step in when political leaders abuse their power, more than 2 in 3 citizens on the continent say yes, the military should step in to when elected leaders are abusing their power. But that does not mean the citizens want the military to stay indefinitely.
Yes.
But they just want the military to come in
to maybe disrupt.
And then, bring back a kind of civilian leadership that can be more responsive to the needs of the people. Of course, sadly, in countries like, Burkina Faso, which is actually one of my favorite countries on the continent, Mali, the military step in and then they get themselves entrenched and they never want to leave. Or if you go to Gabon, they come in and then they say, oh, we are going to allow civilians to take over power. But the military generals then, take off their military fatigues and put on suits and they say, and now I'm a civilian, vote for me. We don't give the voices, we don't really articulate the voices of African citizens enough. I think we have people on this continent that claim to speak on behalf of the people without asking the people themselves.
If you value cutting-edge research and want to hear more academics share their work, subscribe to the Solomon Atah Podcast. Hit like, leave a comment, and help us grow this community. Your support makes it possible for more PhD scholars to share their insights with you. Across Africa, elections continue to be held, institutions continue to function, and democratic language remains powerful. Yet public trust in governance tells a more complicated story. In this episode, we move beyond headlines and political rhetoric to examine what rigorous public opinion data reveals about how citizens actually experience democracy, accountability, and state performance. Our guests help us unpack and interrogate whether African democracies are consolidating, stagnating, or quietly reshaping themselves in ways that demand deeper attention. Professor Boniface Dulani is a political scientist and leading scholar of democracy and governance in Africa, widely recognized for his work with Afrobarometer and public opinion and institutional accountability. His research examines the gap between democratic ideals and lived political realities, focusing on elections, corruption, political trust, and citizen participation across African states. Through empirical data-driven analysis, he provides some of the most grounded insights into how Africans understand power, leadership, and democratic performance today. The Solomon Atah Podcast with Professor Boniface Dulani starts now. Prof, good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
It's great to see you. Prof, where are you at the moment? Because you are a continental scholar, always in between various borders and countries. Where are you speaking to us from?
Well, you managed to catch me in Zomba, Malawi, my home place this week. But I was in Addis last week, and actually tomorrow, I'm down in Pretoria for a couple of meetings until the weekend.
Fantastic. Yes, I did see your Ethiopia engagements on LinkedIn, and of course, very, very in very great work that you are doing there, Prof. You are a researcher at Afrobarometer and IPOR in Malawi. What is keeping you awake at night? What is your research about, Prof?
Well, as you rightly point out, I'm working with Afrobarometer and as a continental research network. I am always really interested to know what's going on across the continent and how we can do the work we do without disruptions. As you know, we've had some military coups, some political challenges, wars in the Sudan.
Yeah.
So I actually worry that we wanted to cover the entire continent, and will that be possible? Will that day arrive, or will we be losing some of the countries where we've been able to do our survey work, and then we are not able to go back because of one reason or another? And my hope is that that doesn't happen, and that the countries where we've had challenges in doing some of our work will open up, and we can always go back.
Absolutely. Prof, looking back at your intellectual journey from Malawi to global academic spaces and back, how has your understanding of democracy evolved when viewed not as an imported institutional model, but as something negotiated within African historical memory, customary authority, and lived political practice?
Yeah, it's quite a great question because as I grew up in Malawi and as I finished, I think, high school in the mid 1990s, there was always the narrative that democracy is a foreign concept.
Okay.
Something that's coming from, or not just coming, but maybe sometimes also perceived as imposed from outside, and then, wrapped together with this idea of donor language that as a condition for you to receive aid, you needed to democratize, you needed to introduce multi-party competition or adopt new constitutions or reform the existing constitutions, among other things. And our former head of state, the late, Dr. Hastings Kamuzubanda, also fed into, perpetuated this narrative, telling us that multi-party democracy is going to, to bring about difficulties. Actually, the language that was used was multi-party democracy is war. That he would warn us that it would not only introduce violence, but it would also bring about instability, civil strife, among other things. But of course, Malawians rejected that narrative when Banda, held a referendum in 1993. Majority of Malawians said, despite all this, fear mongering, we are going to really move ahead and adopt multi-party democracy. Of course, then I embarked, as you rightly point out, on my academic journey, studying in the UK and in the US.
Yeah.
And I think that journey actually, made me realize that actually what the Malawians and African citizens, if I may claim to speak for them, want is not very different from what I think other global citizens out there, want. People, generally speaking, want dignity, whether they are in Malawi or in London. They want fairness.
Yes.
They want to be treated, by leaders who are accountable to them. And I think, across even the continent, and we see that in our service, our citizens want leaders that are constrained, that don't just really, act with impunity. And I think when you see now with what, the developments at the global level, you look at the protests in the US, for example,
Yeah.
you realize then that actually we are global citizens, whether we are in Lilongwe, in Zomba,
Yeah.
whether in New York, in Minnesota. What the citizens really want is the same thing, and that we look at democracy as that vessel that it can help us to deliver these needs, this kind of dignity and the ability to choose who can be our leaders.
Prof, I've got two follow-up questions for you. Okay. So I've been very lucky, privileged to be speaking to scholars and researchers like yourself. So I spoke to one from Rwanda. He says the following: and it's not the only one that has held that view, they are starting to re-look at term limits, which is something that I know has made its way into your own work as well. Whether term limits are working. That's one academic. Second academic, from UCT, Dr. Gavasa Maluleke says the following, that whether, and she spoke around violence and around categories of gender, etc., whether some of the frameworks and paradigms that have been imported, whether they have actually fit snugly. And the third piece, which is now developing into my question, is the following, whether, and where she's also argued that when African states attain independence, the state continues. So the state continue from there. The state did not go back to restart itself before it was interrupted by colonialism. The state that we now have, the form that we have as a form of state, is now a colonial project. It's not necessarily, it's a continuation of the colonial project, quote unquote.
Well, look, I would agree to some extent that the modern African state is an outcome of the colonial experiments and the reflection of the dominant powers of the late 19th century in terms of who had the power and how much colonies that they had. But it is what we do have. So we owe it to ourselves to make the most of this kind of state that has been bequeathed upon us.
Yes.
And yes, I think we've of course tried as much as possible to try and integrate some of that pre-colonial organization that was there before us. But of course, we also do have political leaders who do not really want to go back and redraw the colonial boundaries, or indeed, abolish the existing boundaries and recalibrate and go back into where we were before that. And maybe that is also not possible to do. Now, when you look at this issue of presidential term limits and actually the question of term limits, it's also one example where some people who are against term limits will argue that this is yet another colonial imposition, that we are used to having a local traditional leaders, for example, that wield power indefinitely, and they are only limited to the extent that they were alive. They would only relinquish power upon death, and that a lot of people relate to that kind of leadership. And actually, it is the narrative that the post-colonial leadership tended to build and capitalize on. So again, coming back to the example of our own Kamuzubanda in Malawi, he would go around carrying this fry whisk and adopted titles that portrayed him as this kind of national chief. So if we allowed local traditional leaders to be there for life, then it made sense to have an individual who was a national president to also be there for life. That's why we called our president, the life president.
I've seen those metaphors elsewhere, yes.
And the translation was actually not president for life. It was actually an eternal president. And we see that across the continent.
Yes.
You have Idi Amin, the Idi Amins of the world, among others, the Emperor Bokasas, the Mobutu Sese Sekos, adopting this kind of, symbolism of being these great leaders. But again, we know where that took us. These are leaders that run their countries aground. So that's why I think the idea of presidential term limits, in my view, is not an alien or a Western imposition. It highlights the fact that when we have leaders who can alternate and leave power, we are also giving other people a chance to come in and demonstrate what their capabilities are. That's the beauty of democracy. In the Malawi case, we've been changing a president. In 2014, we changed our president, and then in 2020, we decided, no, we made a wrong decision. Let's change the people we voted for. Let's bring in other people. And then in 2026, with 2025 rather, we decided, no, we should go back to the people we voted out in 2020. So that shows that we are giving the power to the people to say, we want a leader that can deliver for the people. And the only way to do that is to have elections. And if we don't, even if over and above elections, we should have these constitutional mechanisms that can allow us to bring in some new leaders. I always argue that when people say, why should we get rid of leaders who are performers because of presidential term limits? And I would always say that, well, the only reason we know these people are good leaders is because they were given a chance.
Yeah.
So just because they are delivering when they are in office doesn't mean that they are not other people out there who can do a better job than them. So that's really, for me, the beauty of presidential term limits. It allows us to alternate leaders, and it has really nothing, that argument on where these term limits are coming from, whether from the West. I don't think we should just really, stick to institutions, to rules. That is just to say, oh, these are our rules, even if they are failing to deliver for us. I would say, let us also learn from where others are coming from.
Yes, Prof. I want us to stay on that term limit conversation a little bit before we go to other questions. I want us to look at, there is an academic, Dr. Eric Lee, Chinese academic, who argues that China has one of the best meritocracy in terms of leadership meritocracy in the world. And I've gone around and looked around as well, and I've seen that because he argues, I think almost 12 years ago, he's been making that same argument that the US, for example, elects and regrets. And you only elect people based on popularity.
I would agree with that.
So I want us to just Prof, as a political scientist, look at Chinese leadership model, how the Chinese leaders come, according to Dr. Eric Lee, from the ground all the way. You have to be managing units as early as high school. You go to your community, you go from step to step. By the time you are given a region or a province to run, you've already cut your leadership skill and delivered results. And the proof is in the pudding. Prof, China has delivered, you can argue that China's leadership system has delivered more people out of poverty in human history than any other political system. Can you juxtapose that as a political scientist with Africans' articulations around communal leadership, which we can call traditional leadership, as well as their interrogations of term limits, etc.? Is there a relationship there? Is there something to be learned from China?
Well, look, for every China, we can also provide other bad examples of governments and that have claimed to follow the same model. Look what the post 1917 rather. Russia, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and when you had a leadership that claimed to be what did they call? They called themselves, this kind of the Bolshevik Revolution was the guardian, like the vanguard rather of the proletariat. That these are the leaders who were going to take their people out of poverty, and in the end, they ended up taking their people to their grave. Come back on the African continent. Again, we've had this kind of authoritarian leaders that have claimed that, look, what we need is a kind of this unity of purpose. We need to work together because all these, ethnic divisions are going to be even exposed and exploited in a democratic context. But again, where did that lead us? In 1991, for example, in Malawi, the Roman Catholic bishops issued a very famous pastoral letter complaining that the authoritarian one-party regime was only benefiting a minority group in society, whereas the majority were living in lives of misery. Now, you could argue that's a lot of Malawians are still living in that kind of misery even now, more than a quarter century later. But at least now Malawians can then say, we are going to change the leadership. Now, coming back to that example of China, I think it's important, yes, to acknowledge the positive developments that China has made over the years. But that model is also so dependent on who is the leader at the top. Chairman Mao and maybe Deng Xiaoping. I think they set the foundation for the development and the growth that we see in China today. But we still hear a lot of corruption in China. We hear a lot of those very same leaders that we are applauding, a number of them being imprisoned and maybe executed for corruption. So I think maybe it is more the leadership that can set the tone, rather than crediting just the system on its own.
Yes.
Now, even if you come to Africa, there are yes, authoritarian governments that are able to deliver on development. Look at Rwanda, for example, Ethiopia. These are held as development models at the moment, and a lot of people look at them as to say, hey, you know what, that's what we want. As we said, our African citizens want development. As Malawians and many others will say, we don't eat democracy. We need economic gains first before we can even worry about democracy. But again, maybe Rwanda and Ethiopia are the exceptions. And so when you build development on the back of one individual, you are setting yourself on a very unsustainable and very dangerous path. Because once you take out those individual leaders that have the interests of their country or their people at heart, then everything can come down crashing to the ground. So we maybe need institutions rather than individuals, because institutions, the rules, they live beyond individuals. Again, look at Tanzania, when the late president, Magufuli, John Magufuli, he was being held, but he would go here, he would fire people here, he would go there, and everyone is saying, look at that. That's what all of us want for our countries. And then Magufuli dies suddenly, all that momentum is lost. Whereas if that had been built around the institutions rather than the person of the President Magufuli, then maybe I think Tanzania would have been able to build on that gains. Fortunately, maybe they also, Magufuli and other leaders before them helped to set the foundation, but the onus now is on the new leadership to build on that and make sure that they don't regress backwards.
Prof, Malawi has experienced constitutional crisis, court-driven electoral reversals, and peaceful transfers of power. From your vantage point, what does Malawi reveal about the moral foundations of political legitimacy in Africa, and where does it expose fragilities that many African states still struggle to confront?
You're right. I think Malawi, as you know, we've had several crises, but we've also seen what the power of the people can do, and that the political leaders really ignore that kind of power at their own risk. So we're going back to 2019, for example, when we had a very contested election, and then civil society organizations mobilized the people and went on the streets to fight for their democratic rights. And then, of course, the courts sided with the people. Now, I always make the reference that the courts actually went to great lengths in Malawi when they ruled in 2020 that we are not swayed by public opinion. But in just acknowledging the fact that they are not swayed by public opinion, in my view, they were actually highlighting the very fact that they knew that if they don't go with the people, then maybe there would be chaos. So I think Malawi has quite a lot to teach the world
Yes.
as well. I
Yes.
think we might not be, the most economically advanced country on the
Yeah.
continent, or indeed at the world stage, but I think there is quite a lot we can also teach the world
Yes.
about democracy.
Absolutely.
And I think it highlights this kind of domestication of democracy at the moment, and especially when you counterpose this with the global events elsewhere. And I,
Yeah.
I, I don't need to mention what's going on, I think, at the global stage. But here you see that when the people can go on the streets, we had, I think, the military that he went out to defend the protesters. Elsewhere, people, the military goes on the streets to take power for itself. In the Malawian context, and this is not really the first time the military has gone out to defend the rights of the people. Indeed, going further back to 1993, 94, when I think Malawians were fighting for democratization, the military sided with the people again.
Wow.
One very interesting episode that I should mention is
Please.
in
Yeah.
2012, when the late President Bingu Mutharika died in office, and there were some kind of attempts by the ruling elites at the time to maneuver around the constitution and install the late president's brother as president, when the constitution said the vice president would becomes the automatic person to assume the presidency. The schemers went to the military top brass. They summoned the army commander and they actually offered the army commander the presidency to say, take over at least briefly until then you can, after a while, you can hand over back to us. And the army commander said, no, this is a political issue. You solve it politically. I will only go with what the constitution says. And these are things that I think
Incredible.
make some of us really proud to be Malawians. I think when you see people like those who are committed to the democratic order. Again, in 2019, 2020, when the government wanted to suppress protests and demonstrations against the botched 2019 elections, the military were actually there in the front to allow people to protest
To
and
express,
demonstrate
yes.
freely without being intimidated. So these are just some of the issues that you see in the Malawian context that you say, you know what, the world out there also should learn. But also this very fact that I actually think we might actually be getting quite on the extreme side, that in 3 successive elections we've voted out an incumbent government.
Yeah.
Because it shows Malawians are beginning to learn that, look, if you don't deliver,
Yes.
you can lie and you can cheat to us, but there will be one day for reckoning. We will
Absolutely.
be the ones to decide and we will
Yeah.
vote you out.
I think I
my
can now
worry is-
understand your advocacy for term limit, Prof, because it
Exactly.
demonstrates you have lived through that political reality that you
Exactly.
deliver or out.
out.
And you deliver
That's
on
it.
our own terms.
Exactly. And I hope that we also gonna give these people some chance to run, I think, a sustained policy over time, rather than 5 years they're out. But it shows that the people are actually learning. And sometimes people think, oh, democracy cannot, and these were some of the older arguments, that democracy can't work in Africa because of high poverty levels, high literacy levels. There's a lot of literature out there that says that democracy cannot survive in poor societies like ours. But we are actually showing that, you know what, democracy can work.
Yeah.
But elected leaders and presidents can be against term limits, but the people will tell them we want term limits, and we see that from our surveys in Afrobarometer, where support from presidential term limits remains very strong, even in countries like Uganda, where they've removed them, or Cameroon, where they've even never had them. People say, no, we need these limits. We cannot have really presidency for life anymore.
Yeah. Prof, I see you're on term limits, and that's where my next question is, because it kind of relates to statehood, because the countries you've mentioned, Rwanda, Togo, Gabon, we've seen changes in Chad, from father to son. We've seen changes in Gabon before Ali Bongo was pushed out. through some coups. But I want to, maybe this is where you want to go, Prof, and talk about, I think I've got a question for you. That question is coming up, but let's stay on this term limit, and let me put this question to you, Prof. Your work on term limits and executive succession examines one of the most decisive fault lines in African politics. Why does presidential power remain so central to political identity and national imagination in many African countries? And what does it tell us about authority, sovereignty, and the unfinished project of post-colonial statehood?
Yeah, it's quite again another excellent question, and obviously this is really an area that I have done quite a lot of research on. Look,
Okay, Prof.
I think presidential power remains such a very central feature of most of our politics in most of our countries, in large part because the presidency carries so much weight, by far, maybe sometimes even beyond the office itself. The presidency symbolizes a lot, sovereignty, unity, even I think this idea of national destiny. And when you go back, the reason we have this kind of very powerful presidency goes back actually to the colonial
Yes.
period. The colonial administration was very centralized. You had the king, the queen, or the president of France, you name it, as the head of state, and that we are wielding quite a lot of power and influence. So at the independence, we basically inherited this same idea of a very, very strong and unrestrained leadership, and that's, I think, what we have carried on. I think my colleagues who teach institutions talk about the path dependency, that it's very difficult to change some of these traditions. They become so
enshrined.
Yes, so entrenched that we can't even think that we can operate without these institutions. And that's why you see so much resistance from our leaders towards presidential term limits, because they are living in that era where they want to be in office indefinitely. They want to wield power without being questioned. And yet institutions like term limits will say, okay, we might not question you, but after 5 years or 10 years, you have to go and you have to be replaced, whether you want it or not. So that's why we've also seen a lot of leaders seeking to remove presidential term limits. Then, another example here about President Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. In 1986, when Museveni came into office, he in his first speech, he actually said that the problem with African governance are these leaders who stay too long in power. And that once elected, we will be, that's Museveni, we will only be in office for 3 years, no more. Now, I don't know how Museveni counts, how he counts up to 3, because 1986 to now, by my count, that is like 40 years, right? Getting closer to 40 years. But, he said he was going to be in office for only 3 years. But I think there is something that maybe you, Solomon, and I don't understand what happens when these people get into power. It seems to me something really happens that they get to realize how powerful and how to quote, I think, former president, the late Frederick Chiluba in Zambia, he was one of those advocates for term limits. But once he got to office, he actually said in one of his speeches that I didn't know this position is so sweet. So I think they just really get to love that kind of sweetness of the office of president that they don't want to go. Now, of course, even those that have claimed to stick to term limits, you see them, trying other machinations. Either they get their son to succeed them, or
like I mentioned in Chad, Gabon, Togo.
Togo, exactly. Now we're also seeing, in Zimbabwe, now President Mnangagwa proposing that, let's extend from 5 years to 7 years. And usually what they might claim then that, this is now a new setup. So my previous term doesn't count. So it means now I have 7. Then I need another 7. I still respect term limits like that. And then, of course, you have presidents like President Afaweki in Eritrea, who has just ignored the term limits altogether. So he hasn't even bothered to try and go and get them amended. He's just ignored the constitution altogether. But here's the thing, that even if elites remove term limits as they have done, that does the people, the citizens, still cling on to those rules. So when elites remove term limits, citizens really rarely remove them, their belief. That does not translate to removing the belief in term limits among the citizens.
I see.
And that's what we see in our surveys, that the support for term limits remains still strong on the continent.
I will come back to that question when there's a question coming up about Francophone Africa. But let's look at, through your Afrobarometer surveys across Anglophone and Francophone Africa, you have studied how ordinary citizens think about democracy, corruption, and governance. What have you learned about the gap between elite political discourse and everyday political consciousness, especially in Francophone West and Central Africa?
So here's the thing about what we learn from the public opinion surveys on democracy, and I'll come to the Francophone region as well.
Yeah.
So, I've said this many times at many platforms. When you look at the Afrobarometer data, African citizens remain committed to democracy.
Okay.
What is the frustrating thing about democracy on the continent is this failure to deliver. So when African citizens are complaining, it's not that they say they don't want democracy. You see time and time again, more than 2/3 at a minimum of the citizens on the continent to tell us that we want democracy over any other form of government. But when they are asked, how satisfied are you with the performance of democracy? How democratic are your countries? That's where now you see the numbers really being so low. So on the demand side, African citizens remain committed to democracy, but on the supply side, this is where the problem is, that they see leaders who are corrupt.
Yeah.
They see leaders who behave with impunity.
Yeah.
They behave like they are untouchable. Instead of being servants of the people, they now become the bosses of the people. These are the problems. Now, this is also what you have in Francophone West Africa. Because what I think what is frustrating among Francophone African citizens in particular is that they see their governments being more responsive to the former colonial power France than advocating and promoting the interests of their own, the citizens of the interests of their own citizens. And that's why you see, when there was the coup in Mali, for example, there were the youth on the streets out there celebrating that, maybe the military can help us out of, getting rid of these leaders whose interests really seem to be either, promoting the interests of France, or indeed their own families to have a good time so that they can go to fly to France every week to show and then come back. So that's, I think, where the problem is. And unfortunately, this kind of disillusionment and dissatisfaction with democracy is translating into some kind of acceptance for the military involvement in politics. So when we ask across the continent whether the military should step in when political leaders abuse their power, more than 2 in 3 citizens on the continent say yes, the military should step in to when elected leaders are abusing their power. But that does not mean the citizens want the military to stay indefinitely.
Yes.
But they just want the military to come in
to maybe disrupt.
and then bring back a kind of civilian leadership that can be more responsive to the needs of the people. Of course, suddenly in countries like Burkina Faso, which is actually one of my favorite countries on the continent, Mali, the military step in and then they get themselves entrenched and they never want to leave. Or if you go to Gabon, they come in and then they say, "Oh, we are going to allow civilians to take over power," but the military generals then take off their military fatigues and they put on suits and they say, "And now I'm a civilian, vote for me." And we see that again in Guinea.
In Guinea, yeah.
So then there are military people in civilian suits. So you begin to wonder what extent are these civilian leaders. But again, it's the same problem that what the Francophone citizens want are leaders who are there to serve their interests, to promote their interests. And even when people are going through difficult times, but they want a leadership that they can say, even though we are going through difficult times, this leadership is still doing its best for us. And that when things get better, we can also, expect our lot also to be improved.
Prof, let me see if this is a question. In terms of when you spoke earlier about presidential term limits and why the office of the president has so much power, the individuals, even those that have pronounced in the beginning that they do not want to stay or overstay the term limit, end up staying for a very long time. Is this because, especially in French Africa, or of course this is happening across both French and English Africa, is this because there's still colonial influence on the continent or in that office, or is it because the powers that ought to have been relinquished to institutions have now all been congregated or somewhat concentrated, I beg your pardon, into the office of the president and of course that individual? And there's broad suspicion, this is not based on any empirical research, that on the continent, most presidents are co-opted. Do you have, is this something, a sentiment that you've experienced through your research?
Yeah. Yes, and again, the Francophone countries are a very good case in point. Look at the Central African franc, the CFA. The CFA is pegged against the old, French franc. I don't know whether now it is pegged against the euro. And that currency, is being managed, the exchange rate and the like, are being managed from France. So, you have citizens that say, so where is the independence here if the control of our own currency, which is actually one of the symbols of sovereignty. Is still being controlled by France, and we claim to have been independent for 60 years. Where is that independence? And of course, in international relations, though, we say that states are self-interested. States are like individuals. The states want the best for themselves.
Yes.
So, when France and these former colonial powers are, interfering in our politics, it's not because they just have our own, interests at heart. They are also promoting their own interests. So you have to begin to ask the question: why would France continue to cling on to controlling the CFA, to having its own military, in its former colonies? Obviously, it's not the interest of those former colonies, it's the interest of France. If there are benefits that accrue to the former, to the African countries, they are basically secondary to the interests of France and indeed all these major powers. I always remember watching a documentary about the genocide in Rwanda. And there is one case there of a lady who said she traveled to the US at the height of the genocide, and she met a number of officials from the US State Department. And he says one of them said something that I would never forget, and I've also never forgotten that. She said, they told me that the US, is not necessarily interested in Rwanda. The US has interests That's what is the priority for U.S. foreign policy, its own interests, not that they just have some goodwill towards Rwanda and the other African countries. It's their own interest. Now, of course, now we can even talk about U.S. aid and this suspension and blah blah blah. But it means that even U.S. aid, was a tool for advancing the interests of the United States, just like most of aid is for the advancing the interests
Of
of
the
the major
person
Western
offering the
power.
aid, yes.
Exactly. So that's the same thing about these Francophone countries. France has its interests, and yes, the Francophone countries on the continent might benefit something, but it means that at the end of the day, France is interested in its own interests.
Prof, I know you've kind of started talking about this question about Francophone Africa have witnessed military interventions and popular support for anti-establishment movements. From an African analytical standpoint, how should we interpret these developments beyond simplistic labels of democratic backsliding? What deeper currents of political frustration or historical grievances are at play?
Interesting questions. Very deep question, actually. Um, of course, I think, as I said, African citizens want leaders who are there to save and promote their interests. Now, it might sound very repetitive that I keep on coming back to this point, but I think at the bottom level, that's what democracy, the essence of democracy is leadership that can save the interests of the governed. And that's what the meaning of democracy is. Demos, power, Kratos, demos the people, Kratos power. So you want to give power to the people. But as corruption is a major issue. Time and time again, when we ask our survey respondents to say, has the rate of corruption gone up or declined, usually people say it's going up. And the irony is, last time they would have told us it was going up, so already it was high. And then the next survey, we ask them again, it's, it's still going high. So you can imagine the multiplier effects here about the frustrations that people have. That the people we have entrusted with power are more interested in serving themselves rather than serving ordinary citizens. So I think about it this way, that you have this kind of interest in a form of a hierarchy. So you have the major powers, they get their own share of their interest from us. But then our political leaders in saving the people, the other major powers, they also themselves are also getting their own share from the little resources that we have, to the point that what gets down really to them at the bottom, for the common person is very little, if anything. And at the end of the day, we see, the consequences in poor education standards. We see this in poor health facilities. We see this in very high, taxes, for example, and people complaining. And we've seen that in Kenya. The debt burden. We see this in the, it is reflected in poor, water systems, poor sanitation, among many, many challenges because of leaders who are self-serving and are not really serving the interests of the people. And of course, these are worsened, as I already said, by corruption, among other things.
Prof, from your research, both at IPOR and Afrobarometer, what do we know, or what are you seeing? What patterns are emerging in terms of much of Africa's political life is shaped not in capitals, but in rural communities? How does rural political experience complicate the way we measure democracy, accountability, and representation, particularly in countries where formal institutions coexist with customary governance structures?
Yeah. look, I think if there's one major lesson that I've learned in my nearly 20 years doing opinion surveys on the continent,
Yeah.
is the sophistication of ordinary citizens, politically, economically, socially, you name it,
Yeah.
than maybe elites often assume.
I see.
I am always humbled that you know when we share this survey, public opinion is data, for instance, one common question is, what do ordinary African citizens know about democracy? These are people who are educated. They are not as exposed, so they don't know, and they don't know much. So, and yet here you are asking them questions about concepts that only maybe elites in our urban areas really understand. But I'm always humbled, really, when you talk to people, even in some of the remotest parts of our continent. That I can sit here and get the title of a prof because of the work that I'm doing, and the people think that I'm an intelligent person. But the real intelligence actually lies in the people from whom we get the data that we collect. All I'm doing is to channel that intelligence to a wider segment of the population. But it doesn't make the intelligence mine. I've only gathered that from what people know on the ground. So ordinary African citizens, I think, in my view, know so much about democracy, know so much about the things that are going around them. I actually remember one study that we did, several years back, maybe going back 10, 15 years. We were working with a team of researchers from Scotland, and we are
Yeah.
looking at deforestation and the climate change.
Yeah.
And I think the assumption, I guess there was also an agenda, to be perfectly honest, among my colleagues, my research colleagues from Scotland, that most of these problems of climate change are caused by China, India, and all the pollution and stuff. So we go to this area in southeastern Malawi, and we're talking to people about climate change, and and this is a very rural place, and these people tell us that, look, yes, some of these problems are not of our own making. We can blame all the major, these industrial powers that are causing all this pollution that has nothing to do with us. But look at how we have also cut down the trees in our mountains. We are not going to sit here and blame it on China, on India, or on the industrial powers. This is our own making.
That's
We
profound.
when we see now, muddy slides coming, we're not going to say blame it on the industrial powers that are polluting the environment. We have to take responsibility. We also have, just like we have to take responsibility for the deforestation, we also have to take the lead in replanting these trees so that we can avoid some of these problems. They might not address the problem of climate change by any means, but at least we can control that which we have we have responsibility for. That for me tells you the level of intelligence that
Understanding.
is
Yes.
there and the understanding that is there among even our rural-most citizens. So to be perfectly honest with you, the best part for me doing these surveys is not, surveying urban residents. Truth be told, it's very difficult to find urban respondents in our surveys.
Yeah.
But when you meet rural people, you ask them to say, okay, I want to just ask, 1 hour of your time to answer my questions. Those people will sit and give us even upwards of 2 hours of their time, not just answering our questions, but sharing their own experiences on
Yeah.
issues that we haven't even asked them. And you see that, there is a lot of natural wisdom, natural intelligence that exists among our people, even among those that have never stepped foot in a classroom. That I actually feel threatened that if I was in the same classroom with some of these people, then I would have been exposed as,
Prof.
as some ignorant fraud,
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Prof. As a scholar grounded in empirical research but attentive to African political realities, what would a future African theory of democracy look like if it were crafted from African philosophical traditions, social practices, and collective aspirations rather than inherited constitutional templates?
So, look, I think looking again, and I like this kind of forward-looking kind of aspect. I think we need, I think, to develop, that future theory of African democracy has to be one that's grounded, in our philosophical traditions,
Yeah.
not just the Western philosophical traditions, but we need to fuse our own philosophical traditions with what is out there in the West. But we should also be willing to engage with what is out there, because the only way we can develop our own theory and our own vision is by counterposing our theories with those that have been developed from elsewhere. We also have to emphasize, relationality, dignity, even moral accountability, which are concepts that are central to us as a people. The principle or the concepts of Ubuntu, for example, tell us that personhood or being people is relational. We are because you are. That's really that kind of democracy that has to be there. That I'm a leader because you have put me in this position. I am in this position not because I'm someone that should be trampled on because I'm not a leader. The leaders should also respect the people they are serving. I think this is something that we can contribute to the new discourse of African democracy, or theories of African democracy, because Ubuntu really places, in my view, emphasis on community, on the people, not just the procedures, because we see a lot of our leaders now basically focusing or just getting satisfied because they've gone through the motions of elections. We've gone through these motions, we've been elected, now we can do what we want. That really is a departure from, in my view, the concept of Ubuntu. You are
I
a
see.
leader because all of us cannot be leaders. So you are basically first among equals, so to speak.
Yeah.
It always disturbs me when I see, I don't know I don't think this happens in many places, but when I remember one day going to drop a colleague at the airport, and only the way we get stopped that, the president is gonna pass, so we've closed the road. Of course, there's nothing that I could do or we could do. But as we parked on the roadside, I was chatting with the police and I said, "Do you realize it should be the other way around? Because the president is our employee.
Yes.
He should be the one, parking on the side and allowing me as his employer to
Yes.
drive on this road." But we seem to have lost that kind of relationship between the leaders and the people. So we need, I think, to bring back, to infuse this theory of Ubuntu, in our theories of democracy. But that's not to say we should reject elections or constitutions, but that this kind of theory should, Ubuntu, even our own constitutions, should be looking at how they can, build around this notion of Ubuntu. So
Yeah.
the theory of African democracy, in short, and I know I talk quite a lot, but
It's
I
okay.
would say the theory, the African theory of democracy should be one that maybe allows for some hybridity, a fusion of our own traditions, our
Yeah.
own philosophical traditions with, I think, the notions of democracy as it's been inherited from ancient Greece. It should be a theory of democracy that promotes, puts dignity at the center of politics. last week, as I told you, I was in Addis Ababa, and,
Yeah.
I was on a panel where we're deliberating. I think the theme for this year's African Heads of State Summit was the, safe water, as well as the, I think safe water and safe,
Yeah, I think it has something to do with water. Yes, it's a very
and safe
important theme.
sanitation. And one of the things that I was saying, drawing on Afrobarometer survey data, that in this day and age, this is 2026, about 1 in 10%, 1 in 10 of the households on the continent don't even have toilet facilities. And a substantial number have toilet facilities outside their compounds. Now imagine, you have to go to relieve yourself in the day, and you have to walk outside, some distance. Everyone sees that, oh, look at that person. In the night, the kind of indignity that we are, and risk actually, that we are putting our people, our women, our children, people with disabilities, to have to walk to just relieve themselves outside their compound at the risk of even being attacked on the way. Democracy, our theory of democracy, has to lead it to put the dignity of our citizens at the heart and deliver some of these kind of very, very basic needs. But we also need a theory of democracy that can emphasize institutional accountability.
Yeah.
And I emphasize and I underline the word institution here, because as I said earlier, it's not enough to have leaders who can say, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. We need the rules to be what really guide us, not the individuals. Because rules, just to repeat,
Yes.
the risk of repeating myself, rules can live forever. All of us as individuals, we are mortal. We
Yes.
will depart. But we want to, when we depart, the rules, the institutions of democracy that can be there, that can outlive all of us. So in my view, I would say, no, Africa is not just a testing ground for all these democratic experiments, as they've been called. It has to be at the frontier of intellectual revitalization of democracy. And I think we do have the capacity, we do have the scholars who can lead us in that process. And we do have, I should add, data from the very experts, the citizens of Africa themselves, who can tell us really
Yeah.
their own vision of the democracy that they want. Not really something that, academics, the Dulanis of the world, or, people from the West tell us, but let's go to the people and let them tell us what their vision of democracy. So democracy has to be rooted. It has to be from the ground up, not from the top down.
Thank you, Prof. Prof, as we wrap our conversation, final thoughts. Is there something we left out in this very incredible conversation that you and I have had? Is there something that we left out as we wrap it? Final thoughts?
I think I just wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity. And as I said, we don't give the voices, we don't really articulate the voices of African citizens enough. I think we have people on this continent that claim to speak on behalf of the people without asking the people themselves. We have, civil society leaders, and they are all well-meaning, by the way. We have politicians. We even have traditional leaders who will tell you, this is what the people want, this is what the people need, without really asking the people. So I hope that if there's one message that I would want to end up with is, let us really respect that voice of ordinary African citizens. Let us give them their due respect in the governance space by listening to their voices more. And actually, I think, when I look at our politics and how politicians tend to ignore public opinion data, it really worries me quite a lot, because, how else do you know what the people
public is
want you
thinking.
to do for them if you don't really listen to them? So I hope that we can also see interest from our own local leaders, our own politicians, our own philanthropic, people, with these wealthy elites putting in money to resources to organizations like Afrobarometer, so that we can actually say we are not only collecting data from African citizens, but we are also collecting that data with the support of Africans themselves.
Yeah.
At the moment, of course, we are so dependent on the West, but I would want us to also have those resources, coming out from this continent. So that's what
I mean, we can use the
want to
Ethiopian
end.
example. They built a dam when all the
Exactly.
citizens contributed. We read
Exactly.
that the
Exactly.
citizens
And
themselves
it
became
shows you
so
what is,
interested in the dam
yeah,
that they contributed from their pockets. That's an incredible. I don't think we've had enough conversation about
we've
that
not.
very particular effort by the citizens of
And you hear
Ethiopia.
the pride that the Ethiopians have when they're talking about
Absolutely.
that dam, because it is their dam.
Yes.
And they've shown us that it can be done.
Yeah.
We can do quite a lot ourselves by mobilizing resources from the continent. And I hope, to live long enough to see that day when we can say, we are able and capable of taking care of ourselves without having to depend on outsiders.
Professor Boniface Dulani, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Solomon, for having me on this fantastic podcast, and I wish you all the very best.